Thank you for being here for this important discussion. So this month, sort of a last minute thing, we're talking to James Croft from the Ethical Society. Thank you so much, James, for being here. We had talked previously as a board, like we're always coming up with ideas for these monthly meetings. And one of the things that we thought would be interesting would be to talk to people from other humanist organizations across the country about, what their community looks like. And one of the most fascinating ones to me, and I think some of the other board members, was the Ethical Society of St. Louis. It seemed like a beautiful, vibrant community. And so we invited James, and thank you for coming and talking to us. So I will get this kicked off. So hello, James. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at the Ethical Society of St. Louis?
Absolutely. Firstly, hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person, but that's the times in which we're living. It's totally appalling, but it's a real pleasure. One of the only upsides of this time is that I've been able to spend some time with communities like this, humanist communities all around the country and some around the world as well, because people can meet virtually like this. So it's a pleasure for me to be with you, and I appreciate the invitation. How did I end up at the Ethical Society of St. Louis? It's a long story, but basically I'm from London, England. I came to the US to study grad school. And while I was at grad school, I got heavily involved with the humanist community at Harvard. And we were trying to create a real kind of replacement for a congregational community for humanists on campus there. And I was heavily involved in that. And while I was working on that, I started going around to other communities to talk about how we can develop something more like a fully featured community for humanists that created some of the benefits that religious people got from religious congregations, but mostly non-religious people just lose because they don't have anywhere to go for them. And I've just found out that that work was becoming more interesting to me and more fulfilling than my academic work. So I eventually found a way to do it full-time as my profession and trained as an ethical culture leader. That's the name of the clergy of ethical culture congregations. And that took me to St. Louis, where I finished the training, and then they foolishly hired me to stay on, and I've been serving that community for 6 years now, so 6.5 years almost.
So for some of us who might not be familiar with the ethical movement and ethical societies, can you give us a brief introduction to that?
Yeah, so an ethical society is basically like a church without God. We do pretty much everything that a traditional religious congregation would do, except without the explicitly religious or scriptural elements. So we're a humanist community for people regardless of their beliefs, which helps people get through life and meet all the challenges of human existence without reference to God or traditional religion. So we meet on Sundays for regular community gatherings where we have music and a talk. It's kind of like a church service, but no praying, no candles, none of the ritual elements of a church service. We have educational programs, kind of delving into the philosophy of humanism, helping people deal with ethical questions in their lives, learning about history of humanism, things like that. We have pastoral care and counseling. So when people need to speak to someone, maybe they're going through a relationship transition or someone close to them is ill or is dying or something like that, we offer professional pastoral care and counseling. We do community organizing. So we help connect our members to causes which allow them to live out their humanist values in public. And generally, we just exist just like a church is kind of a beacon of Christianity in a community, and we are a beacon of humanism in our community. So we try to be a public representation of humanist values. I think that's the best way I can explain it.
Great. So how big is your community? I mean, like, it seems like you've been around for over 100 years. And so it seems like you're pretty ingrained into the St. Louis community.
Right, we're pretty well established. We've been around 135 or so years, the Ethical Society of St. Louis. And we have about 375 to 400 pledging members right now. Those are adults who give us money. So that doesn't count any kids who are parts of those families. And that translates to a weekly attendance when we're meeting in person of about 140 to 200 people. So we're quite a large congregation. The modal size of a congregation in the US is 100. So most US congregations are about that big. We are 4 times that size in terms of our membership. So we're quite a large congregation, and we are actually worked it out one time. We create so much content and so many events. We're one of the largest humanist cultural institutions in the country. We have a staff of 6 people, and we are constantly putting together events that are open to the public. So in a certain sense, because of our size, we're comparable to a regional or even a national humanist organization in terms of the amount of content that we produce. We just focus it mainly towards serving our local community because we're a different type of organization than an AHA or a CFI or something like that.
Sorry, I rearranged my screen.
I know, it's stunning, isn't it? I've taken your breath away. It's quite surprising. I mean, I'm kind of amazed every time I go to work that it exists at all and that it continues this in Missouri, which is a very conservative state.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's part of the reason why we have so many members is because, unlike on the East Coast, where most of our ethical societies are, it's still more countercultural to be openly non-believing. And so people, I think, feel the need to find others like them and come together. And that's what our community provides. And there's no real choice. I mean, if you want a community like ours, we're it. And so we pull together all those people.
Can I ask the sort of obvious question, which I'm sure you've gotten a lot of times, but can you make the distinction for us between the ethical society and, say, a Unitarian Universalist church?
Yeah, absolutely. We do get that all the time. We're very similar in many ways. So if people are familiar with a Unitarian church and have been to like a Unitarian service, you might recognize similar elements. The differences are firstly historical, right? Unitarian Universalism grew out of liberal Christianity and still maintains, I think, a kind of Christian feel in a lot of their buildings are old Christian churches, right? So they have the pews and they have the pulpit and they feel quite Christian, not all of them, but many. And they have a particular approach to religious pluralism in many UU congregations, such that they try and kind of bring in a lot of different religious traditions to represent the religious diversity of their membership and of the world. So you might go and hear a Christian hymn and then some poem by Rumi and then a pagan drumming or something like that. It's a bit of everything. And ethical societies, we have a different history. We were the first ethical society was started by the son of a rabbi, so we actually come out of Reform Judaism, but he made a much clearer break between his religious background and what he created. It was less of an evolution like UUism was, and more of a he wanted to create something new. He didn't see it as anything to do with Judaism when he created the first ethical society. It was something where everybody could come, regardless of their religious beliefs. And the way he tried to ensure that the space was welcoming to everybody was that instead of bringing in lots of different bits of different religious traditions, he excluded all of them. So he's like, we're just going to focus on this life and the problems that we face while we're going through this life. And if there's another life after this one, we'll build an ethical society there. But in this one, we focus on our problems here. So we don't do any prayer. We don't do any Christian hymns. We don't do any candle lighting. And so our spaces, I think, have a much more secular feel than a UU church does. And ethical society buildings, I don't think they look like churches. I think they look more like community centers. Like they inhabit a kind of space between a church and a community center. They don't scream Christian church to me. So there is a difference, a kind of temperamental difference, and a difference in how we manage religious pluralism.
So how does one become a member of the ethical society versus, and are, you kind of just click a box and you start sending us money? Is there, in Unitarian Universalism, there is like a signing of the book sort of ceremony in some congregations. What is it? How do your folks work?
So first important thing is to say that the vast majority of our programs are open to everybody, regardless of whether they are members or not. We have very few programs that are limited to members. Things like board service is obviously limited to members, and some of the central committees that govern the community are only open to members. But pretty much everything else, including almost all of our public-facing programs, are open to everybody and are free. And I kind of want to stress that every time people ask about membership. You don't have to be a member to be a part of the community.
Yes.
But if you want to become a member, what you do is you fill in a form, you meet with me, the clergy, the current leader of the community, right? We have a conversation about their goals and what they want to get out of being a member, so we can connect them to the right parts of our community and help them develop relationships. And then you send in a pledge form, and the pledge form says how much you're going to give to the community to sustain it. And the pledge form ranges from $0 to however much money they want to give. So people sometimes, because of their financial situation, they submit a pledge form that says $0, right? And that is, they are a full member of the community. We never publicize how much people give. So we don't tie, there is no minimum donation. We do ask everyone to submit the form because we want people to think about it. And obviously maintaining all our programs requires a significant amount of money. But that is how it works. And then they get voted in by the board. And we welcome them in a Sunday morning once a month. We welcome our new members.
So you meet one-on-one with each new member?
It's usually not one-on-one. It's usually like a group of new members over the past month. At some point, we'll get too big to maintain that. But right now, we've been just about maintaining that.
Yeah, James, to your point, I've heard similar things. We have one member that came from Tennessee, and he had a very similar experience there, where their Sunday assembly was huge, because that's the only place they could go to congregate with other secular folks. And having spent a summer down in Tennessee, I know the first thing people ask you is, what church do you go to? That's just the assumption, is that you attend a church. So yeah, I can totally see that. So the one thing that I found sort of interesting is that from an outsider looking in, the idea of secular clergy sounds very interesting. And I know, like, you are very active with all of the clergy in St. Louis, and like a lot of interfaith type stuff. Has that traditionally always been the case, or okay? That's
well,
awesome.
I was acknowledging your question, not
okay. So sorry.
So I have an ambivalent feeling in response to your question. So firstly, I just want to clarify something. Ethical culture is a religion, in the sense that it is recognized as a religion by the Supreme Court. Our communities are given the tax breaks that religious congregations get. I am too, as clergy of that community. And that's actually true of a number of, quote, secular humanist organizations as well. The Supreme Court recognized secular humanism as a religion too, in the same ruling. So it's a bit weird how US government determines what is a religion. But when we were founded, the founder of the First Ethical Society was very clear that what he wanted to do was create a new religion. And he saw it as an evolution of religion that was not theistic, but that's how they talked back then. I mean, this was the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, and liberal religious people, even the first humanists, were talking about humanism as a religion. If you read the first Humanist Manifesto, it calls humanism a religion. And so we've had an evolution of what that term means, such that now I don't think of it as a religion, but legally speaking, I'm obliged to say a religion. And yeah, so we're very unlike many humanist communities, in that we're congregational in our organization, and we have professional leadership, right? I have to train to do this for years. And I think there are lots of benefits to that. And one of the benefits is that I can gain access to some interfaith spaces a lot easier than many of my humanist colleagues, right? Because I can genuinely say, I represent a concrete community of people. Look, there is our building, you know, you can come on Sunday. And I've invited our interfaith partners to Sunday events at the Ethical Society. We also had one of the Catholic, not a priest, but someone who works for the St. Louis Archdiocese come to talk about interfaith relationships. So yeah, we do a lot of interfaith work, and part of it is to enforce in people's minds a couple of ideas. Firstly, that you don't have to believe in God to be a good person, and the monopoly that religion has on a lot of sort of activisty and moral spaces is not acceptable. There are huge numbers of people who are not religious, and they need a voice in that. And secondly, we have a unique moral perspective within these groups. And that moral perspective is very important. Quite often, let's give an example. The Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis that I sit on, we've had a number of meetings since COVID hit to talk about what, if anything, we should say collectively as representatives of the region's religious traditions about COVID. And I've been the only one saying we should say that our politicians are not following the science and not making decisions in the best interests of people, because they're not. And it's really clear that they're ignoring it. And we should say that. That's not a position that comes so comfortably to a lot of religious traditions. And so I've often found that we've led the dialogue. We've led the discussion of things. We can say things about LGBTQ issues that a lot of the religious communities can't, because their position on that is like wrong. And so when Pulse happened, this was the Pulse shooting happened, they weren't even going to discuss it in our interfaith group, because they had a long-standing rule, a kind of silent rule, that they don't talk about LGBTQ issues because it causes too much antagonism between the progressive and the conservative religious communities, and because the Catholic Archdiocese is a big donor to our interfaith group and they get annoyed when we raise their LGBTQ issues. But with me in the mix, I'm like, I'm fucking queer, atheist, like humanist clergy person. I'm not going to let them get away with not saying anything. So it's very useful to have humanists in these spaces because it shapes the debate. So I remember many years ago when there was first the discussion about humanist groups getting involved in interfaith spaces, and there was a huge amount of resistance from atheists and humanists. So we're not a faith, so we shouldn't be involved in it at all. And I'm like, yeah, of course we're not a faith. I totally agree with that. But to shape the agenda, you need to be at the table. So you just have to kind of swallow the name, get involved, and then push for what you want to advocate for. And I think it's significantly changed the perception of our community and the people we represent in St. Louis. I think it's made a very big difference since we've been actively engaged in that stuff. But sometimes it requires you to muscle in. Like you have to say, no, you can't pass that statement because it says everybody believes that people are created. Like it uses language that suggests that everybody is a creation of a divine being. We don't believe that, so sorry, you have to change the language. And you kind of have to be a bastard about it. You have to keep being that person who says, no, not acceptable to us. Yes, we're the only person to whom it's not acceptable, but we're as important as you are, so deal with it. And it's sometimes people get very frustrated, but that's okay.
We do have a question from Naresh. And this was something that I was sort of fascinated too. Out of curiosity, do ethical societies have kids programs similar to what we have in UU Church?
Yes, is a short answer. Some of the time we use their programming, like because they're a lot bigger than us. So some of our societies use the OWL program, Our Whole Lives, the sex and relationship education program, which I think is pretty good. And so we just use that and teach it. So yeah, we have kids programs and stuff. Right now, that's the hardest part of our community to keep going because the kids are on online platforms all the time and they don't want to go on Sunday to another online platform. So we're not finding a lot of success in engaging kids during COVID era. But we're trying to do some of the stuff, but it's very difficult.
I feel like as a whole, a lot of people are experiencing screen burnout and meeting burnout. Like it's tough to keep going. So, and this is a pretty broad question, but do you feel that I mean, obviously, ethical societies are a humanist organization, but do you feel that they're different from other humanist organizations in some way? I mean, obviously, you have what you would call a congregation. I think I might get a talking to if I referred to us as a congregation. And it, just more general, like, I feel like sometimes, depending on where people are coming from as humanists, we might have a very, very strong emotional reaction to anything that resembles church. And like, it seems like I love what you have, where I miss a lot of those things about church. I miss the singing. I was in the choir growing up, but I missed singing in a choir. I'm pretty sure my voice is a lot more wrecked than it was when I was a teenager. But
everything is a lot more wrecked than it was when you were a teenager. That's the ravages of age.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a guy who bails our hay told me a couple months ago. He said, "Do yourself a favor, don't get old."
Yeah,
so I'll start working on that. But yeah, I mean, like, it's one of the reasons I wanted to invite you. Like, ethical society seems like it's what a lot of humanist organizations are, but it's just so much more. You know, like you said, you've got this. You've taken the best parts of a church and stripped out the religious parts. And I mean, would you say that's a fair? I mean, I feel like you've already said
I hope
that.
So the idea of an ethical society from the beginning was kind of to do that. Like, that was the explicit goal of Felix Adler, who made the first one, who we do not revere in any way, and whose writing is weird, and we sometimes refer to it. But it's useful to see, like, historically, he was very clear that he thought the center of religious practice was ethics and teaching people how to live well and in good relationships with each other. We can debate philosophically whether he was correct about that, but that's what he thought. And secondly, he thought the congregation had profound sociological importance because it was the place where people came together to learn how to live better with other people and to sort of generate the moral energy required to spread a set of values in the world. Now, he was writing that before there was a lot of sociological research into congregations, but now we have a lot, and it demonstrates that he was absolutely right. Like, all these studies that show quite conclusively that religious people are more civic and nicer and all this other stuff, actually, when you look at the data, you find out that the reason seems to be because people tend to join congregations more if they're religious, and it's the congregation that connects them to the community and to other people more. And that if you're very religious and not a member of a congregation, you don't show any of those benefits. It's actually the community that is doing the work. And so Adler was correct in his sense that these are important social capital and human development institutions, and that we can't lose them just because we give up belief in God. We need to keep the community and get rid of God. But I felt more about this as I've kind of been involved in writing a book about this whole idea, that institutions like the Sunday Assembly, like ethical societies, like the Oasis network of humanist communities, etc., have hit upon a really important truth, which we often kind of forget, and particularly non-religious people are in danger of forgetting, which is that from a naturalistic perspective, religions develop to fulfill human needs. They have nothing to do with God or anything like that. That stuff, the mythology and the practices of a religion, develop to fulfill needs that the human organism has. And they have persisted because more or less they do that pretty well. Like they're social organizations which fulfill human needs pretty well: existential, spiritual, social needs. And just because you are not religious doesn't mean you're not a human being. You still have the needs that the religious communities developed to meet. You just then suddenly don't have the institution in which to meet those needs anymore. So I see the development of humanist congregations not as kind of religifying atheism, but re-secularizing these needs that were kind of colonized by religion. There's nothing inherently religious about getting together in community or singing in a group or talking about the meaning of life. That is not inherently religious. That's inherently human, and we've just let religions have a monopoly on it for a long time. And I see what we're doing as trying to reclaim that space for the secular world.
James, I have a couple questions I'd love to talk about on that front. I'm not sure how long you've been, how young your local group was when you joined it. So I'm not sure if you personally experienced some of the same challenges we're facing as a community right now in terms of being a leader and trying to help, your group scale, but maybe you can't speak to this, and I just love your input either way. We have been for the last several years now trying to make this transition from a group, a community that meets in any number of spaces that we can get, free or low rent or low cost lease, and it's been a real challenge. So we've we've started the process of reworking our financial priorities to save up enough to either get a long-term lease, buy a building, something along those lines. And we've been working towards that. So I guess the first thing I want to ask is twofold. First, can you give us some thoughts on how important you feel it is to have a physical space for your community that is yours? That like a building or a long-term lease that your group controls. And the second is, if you were involved in it or you've talked to people who were, what is it like making the transition from being a sort of homeless organization to one founded in a space? And what are some of the challenges that groups tend to run into?
Wow. So the building question is a major one, right? We have had this current building, which was built for our community 55 years ago or so. So not within my
so you weren't
lifetime.
there.
Yeah. And then the previous building was built like 100 years ago. So, and there are ethical societies with their own building and other ones that rent a space and don't have their own building. So we have communities within our network that are in both positions. And what I'd say is that there are things you can do with your own space and a certain amount of security you can have that you can't have if you don't have your own space. But there are risks to having your own space as well that don't exist when you don't have it. One of the things that we deal with on the risks end of things is that sometimes, particularly when you own a beautiful historic building like ours, and I'll try and post a link to a picture of it in the chat, some aspect of the membership, maybe members of the board or the finance committee or the building committee or whatever, come to feel that the maintenance of the building is your main job rather than the development of the community. And the building should serve the community and its values, not the other way. The community doesn't exist to maintain the building. And honestly, some of our ethical societies are so tied to their building that they've become really kind of rental institutions with the congregation attached, because they're desperate to make the rent on their, to be able to afford their building. And it's like you're not achieving your real goal. So that's always a worry. But on the other hand, it's really important to develop a community over the long term, right? To have some stability in the type of people who are coming every time you have a meeting, and to be able to get to know them. It is the relationships between people that make a community what it is. And that's so much more difficult when you're moving from place to place, or you're meeting in a bar or wherever you just can't have the space and the ability to relax and develop the communities that you really need. So it's a difficult challenge for new groups. I'm always in awe at how many churches are able to do it every year. I mean, they do it. Like Saddleback Church started in someone's basement. So, you know, they do find a way to do it. So
I think they
I
find
think,
it easier to ask for a lot of money.
yeah,
Personally, I think it comes
Yeah.
down to that a lot because it's biblically mandated. So it's like, you know, it's a little easier to go, give me money. And by the way, it should be 10% of your income.
yes,
Which is,
yeah, it's more culturally accepted, and there are kind of more existence proofs in the sense that there are lots of successful Christian churches out there, and everyone kind
Right.
of knows what they're getting into, right? Like they can see the end product, whereas
Mhm.
most humanists have never been to a community like ours. Like we get people visit occasionally, and they come on Sunday because they want to see what it's about, and they're like, they can't process what they're seeing sometimes. They're like, we didn't know it was possible to do this. And that's one of the reasons why I used to go around the country talking to people about the ethical sign, showing them pictures and saying, this is what is possible. Like people
Yeah.
built this. This building, everyone's like, oh, which church did you buy your building from? I'm like, no, we built it. It was built for us. And this is a second building that was built for us. Our community made this happen. And so, and I tell you, one of the funnest things about my work has been seeing the communities I visited develop into real things. Like when there's a very successful Sunday assembly in LA, and I visited what became that community many years before I think even Sunday Assembly existed, and met with a group of people who really wanted to make a community. And those people made that. Like that, it really became something. And there's been a number of them that I visited, and then suddenly people have a bigger idea of what's possible. So it really is about having a clear vision and enrolling people in that vision and convincing them they'll get something valuable out of it. And the secret about money is that people like giving. They feel good about giving. I was always terrified about asking people for money. People want to be asked. I'll never forget when I first made a big financial ask from a potential donor for a specific project. And I asked for what I thought was a ridiculous amount of money. And they didn't give me that amount of money. They gave me a portion of that amount of money, but they said, thank you for asking. I appreciate being asked. I was like, what? WTF? I don't know what the adult level of this meeting is, but I was amazed by that. So don't be afraid to ask for money. Get good at it.
On the building side again, circle back a little bit. I guess you talked about a risk, and I know for us, you know, we're aware of some risks. Obviously, someone with a building is much more aware, but for us, we're just very focused on the things that we can't do without that space. Something like, you know, we don't have a dedicated space for childcare attached to where our adults meet. We don't have a dedicated space for community weddings, which, you know, granted probably doesn't happen a lot right now, but we are looking to have, like, you know, a place where anybody of any relationship, of any sexual preference, what have you, can honor their love with their partner without judgment or having to do like counseling with the pastor at a church and, you know, stuff like that, where they might try to talk them out of it or whatever. Cause you hear all kinds of stories, right? So we want to have a place where, you know, the building code and the policy surrounding the building honors the values of our community as well, which is a huge deal. And then there's other opportunities that come along with that. I guess I just am interested in hearing some of the ways that you feel like your community uniquely benefits from a building and having that space, and how it's kind of worked out for you guys.
Yeah, well, I think what you say about being able to determine the kind of regulations that govern the use of the building so that they fit your own organization's values is very important. So there are things like how you're going to deal with bathrooms, right? We're doing this whole thing about moving to gender neutral bathrooms. We can do that because it's our building. So we can say who can use what bathroom, and that matches the sort of values that we want to promote in the world. We can put up a Black Lives Matter banner and have a bunch of people holding signs every month in the vigil that we do at the top of our property against the road, because it's our property. We can do what we like, right? So you can definitely advance the mission of a community in ways that you cannot if you have your own space, because you have control over how that space is used. And that's particularly important, I think, for us, because, we're still a religious minority in America, right? And the cultural power of Christianity, and particularly conservative Christianity, is still very strong. I think it's breaking a fair bit, but it's still very strong. And I think it's quite important for us to have homes where we can shape them according to our own values. And as you say, people feel more safe there. People just feel like they can have, it's something really cool about having a space where people can just pop in and hang out for a while and chat with each other. I'm always surprised, this was back when our building was open, and I would be working in the office, and I'd occasionally walk around the building and be like, oh, some of my members are here hanging out, playing Mahjong. Why? Because they wanted to come and play Mahjong. Like, I didn't know they were there. That's fine. There's no program. They're just hanging out in our building. That's really nice. Like, people don't have community spaces like that anymore. They use, and what you'll find too is that all sorts of community events and activities start to happen using the building as the nexus. So we have monthly cycling. It's called Ethicyclists. Everything has to have some ethics pun attached to it, like our Ethicurian dinners. Ooh, that's the worst thing about my community, is the bad ethics puns. But the cycling group, they meet in our parking lot, and they go, like, they use it as a place to meet, to go off. Or sometimes someone can't host a potluck in their own home, but they want to host one, so they use our building to host a potluck. And then people will come to you and be like, oh, I want to do a book group. I want to do a science fiction book group. And we're like, sure, just book a room. We've got all this space, like, use it. It happened at Harvard too. When we finally had our own hub space, people came up with ideas for things that they'd always wanted to do. They just never had a place to do it. It becomes a real community resource that you control. And it's amazing how much that can unleash the energy of a community.
It's good to, a part of me just wants to hear someone who's done it, who has it, and just hear that affirmation, because it's something we've been trying to work towards for so long that you really just want to hear stories of it working for other folks, and just kind of the encouragement of going, yeah, that's worth it. I want to do that. I still want to do that.
It's so worth it. And if you need to convince people, they can always come and join one of our Sunday morning gatherings and see what it's like when you have resources. Like, this is a great thing, by the way. This is a really well organized event, so you're doing great. But we had an all ethical society kind of national meetup, not this past Sunday, but the week before. And we had 365 connections. And it was like amazing. It was amazing to think that there were people. We had people from all over the world, humanists tuning in to be in community with each other. You feel it when it's done well, and there's that critical mass of people. You're like, okay, this is a different level of possibility for humanist community, and it does make a big difference in people's lives. I am kind of an evangelist for it.
To switch tack, go ahead, Ben.
No, go ahead,
I've been
Nathan.
asking
I'll let you. You're following up. Keep going.
Well, actually, I was going to switch topics just slightly to the membership, and discuss. We've been working this year. Kind of one of the things we figured we could still work on during the pandemic was like our onboarding process, and just refining, how we think about people's journey from discovering our community through becoming like dedicated members, people who have bought in and want to reinvest in the community with their time, talent, and resources. And so we've created this like user journey map. Well, we've converted what's called a user journey map into a community member journey map, and tried to like identify the different stages. And one of the things that we feel like is probably pretty accurate, but I'd love to hear, like, for someone who has like a kind of an onboarding process that's well established, and you guys are regularly bringing people through it, I'd love to hear what you think is like the primary hook for new people. Our guess, and based on what we've seen, is that our most popular groups, so the groups that get people funneling through most often, are folks who have immediate needs. So like recovering from religion is like an immediate, like, I need help kind of thing. And that single group probably has more people flowing through it in a given year than all the other groups combined in terms of new people showing up. But they also have a huge drop-off rate because there's not necessarily a system in place yet to keep those people connected to things and then kind of guide them toward new stuff after their immediate need of, I just need someone to listen to my story is met. What kinds of things, maybe even other than that, oh, I need immediate help right now, have you found that people are drawn to and is a good entry point?
Okay, so firstly,
that's a big one, I know.
It's a great question because we are actually doing that exact process right now at the Ethical Society of St. Louis. We are doing an inventory of our visitor to member pipeline and trying to come up with something different, because actually we are not that great at that. We have a lot of visitors and we're not that great at converting many of them into long-term members. We get enough because we get so many visitors, but the percentage of them who convert is not high.
Right.
So we want to increase that. So we're doing I'd love to see what you've come up with, because you may be ahead of us in the process of thinking carefully about that. I will say a couple of things. The first is, buy this book. It's extremely religious, but it is exactly about this issue of converting. It's a really good framework for thinking about this, and we found it very useful, because what it really says is invest in the people you have and make the people you have incredibly happy, and the people who join will feel it. And
that's cool.
And so it's a very good philosophical shift. And it has a really good metaphor of the difference between opening the front door, which is lots of outreach and getting people to come, which is what we're already good at in St. Louis, versus closing the back door, which is like making sure the people you get to visit stay. And that's what we need to work on. That's exactly what we're doing right now.
That's our exact same problem. When we ran the numbers through our journey was, we're on a different scale than you all, but when we look at our meetup group, our Facebook group, I think we have thousands and thousands. We think we probably get, exposed to about 10,000 people a year. I mean, it's a rough estimate, but it wouldn't, I think that's very reasonable to guess. And yet, we probably only convert 5 to 10 new members a year, maybe a little bit more on our good years. And so that's obviously a huge disparity between that, where people are clearly dropping off between, hey, this group exists, and maybe even, going to an event or going to our website or whatever and actually getting involved. And then amongst those who get involved, we have even obviously the number of people who go from I'm a member on paper and I have a subscription to the website, to keep my membership active. Those people filter down even smaller to basically the 6 to 10 highly involved board members and volunteers. And that obviously doesn't include all of our hosts, which are also, I would say, much more involved than the average. But to see those numbers increase throughout the pipeline and not just stop at that big one, that's one of our challenges. And like you said, if you guys are reworking that too, I think it'd be great to compare notes, because that's definitely what we're working on as well.
I'd love to do that. I think one of the main insights that I've taken away from the process so far, from that book particularly, is that people stay in communities because of the relationships they make with others there. There's a line in that book where it's like, look, if you have 3 of your best friends who are members of your church, and this is written for Christian audience, this book, so obviously it's this church, it doesn't matter how good the sermons are or how good the coffee is, right? You're going to go to see your friends. And that's what you have to work towards. And it also says that one of the challenges is for established communities is that people have a limited number of connections they're able to make in their life. It's like Legos. And people who have been a member of a community for a long time, they tend to have all their Legos filled. And so you have to get new people to connect with other new people. And that is the thing you need to program for. So we're already changing some of our programming, even the online programming we're doing, to encourage developments of connections between new people who are, it's incredibly difficult right now. We don't expect to grow during COVID.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre to think about asking someone to join a community when they've never been to the building. Like for us, it's just weird to think about it. But
that is an incredible insight. I love that. The new to new. That's
yes,
brilliant.
Right. And this book promotes the small group model whereby you get everyone into a small Bible discussion group. And we just can't imagine culturally requiring new people to join a small, even if we're like, yeah, it's the God delusion. We're all going to read the God delusion. We can't imagine doing that to our people. So we have to come up with something different. But we are thinking right now about possibilities of what that could be. And one of the challenges, of being an established institution like ours, we have a lot of practices and policies that we've been doing for literal decades. And it's difficult to change an institution when it's been doing things become embedded. And suddenly you ask, why do we do that? That doesn't help. Like, why? Like, we have a process right now where every visitor, when they enter our auditorium, which is this big, beautiful kind of sanctuary type space, has to approach a table and give us their name and email as they go in on a book. And it's like, is that really the most welcoming way? Is that the feeling we want people to have when they come for the first time, when they're about to listen to this beautiful music and into this beautiful space? We're like, oh yeah, just give us your name and email as you go in. Isn't there a different way we could do that? And everyone was like, oh yeah, that does kind of suck. Why have we been doing that for 40 years? Like, and so there are downsides to being established, is that you're less flexible. But yeah, we're engaged in the same process that you are, and I'd love to talk about it more, because I literally just took over as the senior clergy person at the society in June. And one of my big contributions, I hope, will be developing a better pipeline from visitor to membership, because I think that will help us a lot.
That kind of gets to the question I had earlier, is, the importance that you play, or any sort of professional clergy member of the congregation plays, in developing the congregation, making sure it's vibrant, sort of the care and structure and vision that a professional clergy member provides to your community congregation.
Yeah, well, look, I'm going to make a pitch here, and not everyone agrees with me within the humanist and atheist world. So, but that's
You're talking
okay.
to a humanist chaplain, so keep going.
Yeah, right. So I think professional leadership is really important. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, accountability. A lot of our small humanist groups are effectively led by the person with the biggest personality and the strongest vision, but there is no structure to hold them accountable. There's no group in which leadership doesn't exist. It's either implicit or explicit. That's the only options. And I think explicit leadership is much better than implicit, because at least you can hold the person who is designated the leader accountable by a series of rules that you have established to keep them accountable. Like, I used to be having these arguments about how the atheist community doesn't need any leadership with like bloggers like PZ Myers, right? And PZ and I get along a lot better now than when I was a lot younger. But he would be like, we don't need leaders, we don't need anybody telling us what to do. And I'm like, it's not about people telling people what to do. It's about having accountability mechanisms in place. Because right now, bloggers were the leader of the movement. Like, PZ was a leader, right? He was clearly modeling certain behaviors and encouraging certain people to engage with each other in particular ways. He just wasn't accountable to anybody. And that sucks. Like, you want accountability. So that's one reason I think professional leadership is important. Secondly, organizational development is hard. It requires skills. You don't have nonprofits that are successful usually with people who aren't professionals, who are trained to do it or have learned, like, through the hard way from making a lot of mistakes, how to run an organization. Like, I have to manage 6 staff people. That requires a certain amount of training, right? That you don't get to be able to do that without learning how to work with people and how to put together a budget and how to deal with, problems of performance and things like that. And in terms of, you mentioned kind of vision, I don't like the word that is used. So instead of like reverend or rabbi or something, the honorific for an ethical society clergy person is leader with a capital L, which I think is a bit pompous and outdated, and I would rather change it to something else. But it is good in articulating the importance of moral and organizational leadership to any community. Because frankly, not everybody wants to stand up and give a talk about how we should live life, right? So I'm a philosopher. I trained for a long time to think about these questions. And I don't know, I haven't found, people often tell me like humanists don't want leadership. And I just think they don't want bad leadership. And we've had a lot of bad leadership institutionally and in terms of the people who we look up to. So I have like, when you're in a crisis like COVID, it is essential that your community has designated people who are making the decisions. I decided that we closed, right, when we did. And I've decided that we haven't reopened yet, right? Unlike a lot of the religious communities in town, which are just being so irresponsible and so angry. And I'm the public face of the community defending that decision and responding to people's questions about it. And people know where the decision like ultimately ends up. And I think that's very valuable. I don't get to tell people what to do or what to believe. Like, I'm not a dear leader, but I'm trying to exercise clarity of vision, give people a sense of purpose, take responsibility for things that need to be taken responsibility for, and provide direction. And that any community needs all those things.
So who is your accountability? Like, what is your accountability structure? If I can
I'm
ask.
accountable to the board in the sense that the board has oversight over what I do to a certain extent. The board is elected by the members. All communities are democratically run, so the national body does not determine who's going to lead which community. It's not like the Catholics or whatever, we get sent somewhere. But a community has to vote to install someone as their leader. So I've been through that twice now, when I was their secondary leader and now their senior leader. So I have been voted in by the community. There are, every 4 years, they send out an anonymous survey asking people how I'm doing. And that is an evaluation of my qualities or problems as a leader. And ultimately, they could fire me, right? If they didn't like the direction I was leading the community or felt like I wasn't doing a good job, they could say, we don't want to continue your employment. They have perfect kind of control over that. I also guess I'm accountable to our national organization to some degree. We have a professional body of leaders, a kind of council, and we're accountable to each other for our professional behavior. Honestly, I think that the accountability systems in our movement are a little looser than I would like, because we're so tiny. Like, there's only 24 ethical societies, and only a handful of those are big enough to have professional leadership. So I do a weird job. There's like 10 people in the world doing the job that I do. So weird. But yeah, and I think there's an element of, I was going to say spiritual accountability, but I want like philosophical accountability, in that I see myself as an avatar of humanism, right? I'm a public reflection of my community's philosophy and values, in the same way that anyone who sees like a priest in a robe, they're like, oh, they represent Christianity or some faction of Christianity. Now, I don't get a cool hat or the red Gucci shoes or whatever. We don't have any clothes, or anything like that. It's really unfortunate. But within St. Louis, within the circles I move, and when I'm working professionally, people know who I represent. And that, I think, is a form of, I think more carefully about how I comport myself, because I represent the community. I don't want to reflect badly on my community. I delete a lot more Facebook posts than I used to, for instance.
We all do these days, I think.
Well, that's just getting older then, maybe. Like, that's not a good idea to post that.
So ultimately, you make the decisions, but the board could step in and say, we don't like that decision, James.
Well, so within our governance structure, this is a really nerdy question.
I'm sorry. If this was boring to everybody else, we can back off somewhere.
No, I'll just be quick about it. But I get certain specific decisions, like programming decisions and stuff like that, staffing decisions, and they get other specific decisions. And so it's very clearly laid out who is responsible for what. And that's one of the major institutional challenges for anyone building a community, is making clear who is responsible for what, particularly when boards are involved, because boards often want to take more responsibility than they really should have. Like, I really am very grateful that the society was led for 15 years by Kate Lovelady, my predecessor mentor, and she was really good about being clear about where the board ended and where the staff began. And so she was able to say, that's not your decision. Like, okay, I hear that you don't like this programming decision or whatever, it's still not your decision to make, and we're going to do it anyway. And sometimes that's what leaders have to do. They have to say, I disagree with the board on that. You know, if you really hate it, fire me. Like, but usually you have a good working relationship, and you just work through disagreements like that.
I ask that question in a sense because our internal debate, as Nathan mentioned, you know, we want to do this, like, have the space of our own that is humanism within Central Ohio, and there was also this this question, this desire of, you know, when do we start bringing on professional people, and what do those professional people look like, and what are their roles? And in the past, that has been a little blurry, I think. And so it sounds to me like you're finding those boundaries being set up between the board's responsibilities and whatever the professional leadership is of the community. Like, those boundaries are very important.
Yes, and the relationships of trust between the people. Like, ultimately, all organizational leadership is about relationships with people.
Right.
And you can have great systems, but if there isn't trust and goodwill between the people, they're not going to work. So get good at really developing relationships and putting clear systems. Like, I've seen a lot of very promising humanist leaders kind of pushed out the movement by inappropriate behavior by boards of organizations that have hired them to do a job, and then haven't let them do the job because they have a different idea of what should happen. And I just really think that's tragic, because it's so self-sabotaging. Like, the board has to hire someone and trust them to lead, and at least give them the leeway that they should have within their professional area to make decisions on behalf of the community. And this actually leads me to say something really important that I haven't said yet. Not every community is for everyone, and you're never going to be able to create a community that everyone wants to be a part of. And that includes every humanist, right? There are plenty of humanists in the St. Louis area who will never want to be part of the Ethical Society of St. Louis. And it is not our job to be the community that every humanist wants to be a part of. You have to decide who you're for and be for those people, and that's okay. Like, you don't have to be for everybody. And sometimes I see groups getting tripped up because someone will come and they're really enthusiastic and they want something particular out of the group, but it's not what the group was set up for. And so then they want to get in a position of leadership. They want to change what the group does. And then there's like a disagreement. And you have to stick to your vision and say, what you want is totally valid. You go and make that organization, but it doesn't have to be us. Like, we don't have the resources and we don't have the skills. And so it's okay to serve. Ideally, we would have 100 humanist organizations in Central Ohio. Like, there are hundreds of churches in Central Ohio, and they would cater to different people. But we don't have that. So we have to be okay saying, you know what, this isn't the sort of humanist community for you. That's okay. That's not a problem with us. Like, as long as you're not being like discriminatory or exclusive in that way. It's programmatically, I mean.
I would say that actually, I feel like in Central Ohio, that's one thing we're pretty good at, is we have a lot of organizations where people are not shy about, this isn't what I want. I'm going to go start my own thing. We're like,
right. So you're very decentralized.
Yeah. So, and you know, I feel like we've got a pretty decent working relationship with all of them, and you know, we share information and try to support each other, and it always sort of fascinated me in the past. But you know, you're right. Like, you know, even the tiny little town that I grew up in, Northeast Ohio, had like 5 or 6 churches. So
right. I
something for
once
everybody.
counted how many churches I passed when I used to cycle to the Ethical Society before I learned to drive, which is the worst thing I did for my waistline in my life. But I used to cycle, it's about 7 miles, and I passed maybe 40 churches. And there's one ethical society in the city, right? So it's
Wow.
just, when you think like that, it's clear one organization can't serve every humanist, and that is okay. And like having a clear idea of what you want to do and who you want to be for is really key. And you'll find those people, and they'll be much more committed to you because it's clear what you want to do and it fits what they want.
That's it's so funny that you put it that way, because now when I think back through, the different religious cultures in my community growing up and things like that. Oh, sorry, Polly, is my audio bad? I sorry, it's all comment. Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Fine.
So one of the interesting things about the culture is like sometimes it was literally like, that's the church that does this type of music. That's the church that serves coffee. That's the church that has the most like kids programs, or, and it was like nothing changed on a fundamental level between what they taught, what they preached, or anything like that. It was literally just like different niches, basically. Just that these people, decided to go all in on this one type of group of Christians, and it probably shouldn't be any different for humanists when it comes to figuring out, what works. Particularly, we had a meeting with somebody who specializes in helping people find or build religious and non-religious community, and she talked about establishing that third space in the neighborhood. So you have your workspace and your home space, and then you have a third space in your community where you go and you build, a connection to those around you. And she talked about the importance of making sure that the type of third space you create fits the area you're in and the people who are there. And that just feels like it ties in very neatly with what you're talking about, this idea of creating a space that matches the people in your proximity, and being okay with the fact that if somebody comes and visits from like the other side of the city, or is just not involved in that sort of subculture, that they're maybe not going to feel quite as at home as the people who live there, because it's for the people that live there.
Yes, that makes total sense to me. And what you said at the beginning of your comment about how the churches kind of decided what they were going to be about, a lot of the congregational development literature that I've read has suggested that a single community should strive to be good at one thing, and like to be really good at one type of program, whether it's kids programs or whether it's like Sunday morning worship or whatever it is be the place for that, and then you'll find those people. I do think this is an argument, not a discussion, that we have internally a lot, because we're the only humanist community around. We do feel like we have a bit more of a responsibility to be open to things which our members want to do that are not necessarily directly laser focused on our specific mission. Because if I wanted to, I could go through all the stuff our members organize in our building and be like, some 40% of this is not directly missional, so we're just not going to do that anymore. But I don't want to do that, because those people don't have anywhere else to go to do that stuff, and they're volunteering their time to do it. Yeah, it takes up kind of institutional resources and space. So we are a bit more of a grab bag than like the really focused communities that just do one thing. And I think that is okay because of the weird landscape that we're serving a very broad and diverse community with one space. But the type of experience that you create and the sort of person who's driven to that experience, like I think it would be great to have a Sunday assembly in St. Louis alongside us. And I don't think I would, whenever people come together and try and start Sunday assembly St. Louis, we're all like, yes, we'll give you space, we'll give you money, do it. And then they're all like, oh, we'll just join the ethical society. Like, oh, okay, well, fine. That's great too. But I don't think that we compete, right? We offer different experiences for different types of people who are looking for different things. And that is great.
So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and ask you if you have any advice for a humanist group that wanted to transition to a more ethical society model. I mean, have you seen that happen? Or do you have any thoughts on what would be involved?
Your audio cut out for just a second. So can you say the question one more time?
What advice would you give to a humanist group that wants to transition to a more ethical society model?
Oh gosh. Well, so recognize that it will be a lot of work, but that it will be worth it. That what you create will be unlike what you can do if you're offering a kind of a series of programs that doesn't develop people into a community. I don't know what your community looks like. It already looks like you're doing great stuff because this is a really good program. But a lot of the humanist communities I meet, they offer a series of relatively disconnected programs like talks. And sometimes relationships develop between people because they go to the talks. But the focus is not on connecting people and helping them live life together. The focus is on the programming, you know, and it's a place to go to see an interesting talk. And I think it's really difficult for humanist groups to kind of get out of that mindset of this is not where the community event is to facilitate the development of the community. It's not that the talk isn't important, but that's not kind of why you're there primarily. You're there to be in community with these people. So it means kind of thinking about changing the sort of people you invite to speak if you have regular speakers. Like we very rarely invite academics anymore because it's not quite the right sort of talk. Like it's too informational, right? We want something more emotionally engaging, more narrative, more about how to live than about this is some interesting information about evolution. Now, sometimes we'll do that, but we have to think a bit differently about what we program. Think about engaging people in lots of different ways. So the quality of the music is really important, and the way that you kind of bring people together into a space. Like you have to curate an experience, which is rather different from being just having a talk. Like there's just a different quality of experience when you has designed the whole thing to feel like a cohesive structure. You have to set up really clear governance structures. And I mean, really, ideally, there would be a kind of consulting group, like a church planting group for humanists who would help them go through this process because it's quite an involved process. But I think the biggest thing is hold on to your vision. Like the groups that have done this, like the LA Sunday Assembly and the Humanists of Greater Phoenix, which got their own building and really built a community there and have been doing great things. They had a few people who really believed in it and they wanted to get it done, and they found the people who also believed in it and were clear about what they wanted and what they didn't want from the outset. And then they worked with those people to kind of make it happen. I mean, I honestly wish I had a better answer to this question because I get it asked so much. And I honestly wish the American Ethical Union, our national body, had a better institutional answer. I wish I could say, contact the AU and they'll give you a ton of resources to help you start a community. But honestly, we haven't been that great at that either. There have not been that many successful new ethical societies built. One of the big projects which would be so great, which would be amazing if the AHA or someone did, would be to put together like a box of resources, which is how do you create a fully fledged humanist community? This is what the steps you have to take, and this is how you do it. I know Sunday Assembly did something like that, but they've kind of stepped back from facilitating that a bit because it became unmanageable. I don't know that box of stuff exists, so I'm going to think about that question some more and kind of contact some people and see if can put something together. COVID time might be a good time to work on that. Not that I'm not working all the time anyway.
That segues nicely into the next question. So what sort of things, like, I mean, I think we're all struggling with maintaining our communities during COVID, and how do we keep people engaged and provide that community? What has the Ethical Society done to over the last couple months, and are you planning anything different going forward?
Okay, so we closed in the middle of March. So it's been almost 5 months that our building has been closed, and we haven't hosted any events there at all. We made the decision to close on, I think, a Tuesday evening, like March 10th. And on Sunday, we had our first ever virtual gathering, and we have not missed a Sunday since. So we just transitioned. We didn't miss a beat. I was so proud of us, because honestly, we are not a very online community. Before this, we had no online programming, nothing. Like, we were all meet space all the time. And then, because we were forced to, by Monday the 16th, the Monday after the week we closed, we had a calendar of weekly online events. We had 4 events that first week, and we have tons now. And honestly, it actually kind of chokes me up, because the amount of work the staff has done to enable that to occur, and the amount of learning that it has involved has been astronomical. I'm a gamer, right? And I love being online. And so I have this sort of setup already from doing podcasting and stuff that enabled me to kind of slip into it easily. But that's not the case with most of our members. Are over 60. That's the average age of our membership. And many of them do not have never been on a Zoom meeting before. So we had to do, like, we called every member of our community, so almost 400 people, called them to talk them through the process and ask if they needed tech support, let them know what we were doing to get people. And now we have people in their 90s joining us on Zoom, and it is freaking fantastic to see that. There's some of the most enthusiastic participants. We just started another call round of all our membership to just check in to see how people are doing, and seeing we're missing a lot of people that have never attended. And I don't know whether it's because they don't want to or because they can't. And we want to make sure that everybody can if they want to. We are hitting the point where those who are minimally satisfied with the Sunday stuff and with the other programming are pretty happy. Those who are not are pretty unhappy. Like, they want to be meeting again. And the way we're talking about it in St. Louis, I don't know how it is where you are in Ohio, but we don't see much prospect of us meeting in person again until there's a vaccine, because of the way that our state and city government has handled this. There is more infection in our community than pretty much any time since the beginning of the lockdown. So we can't, if it made sense to be closed all that time, it doesn't make sense to be open now. It's more dangerous than when we began the lockdown. And so we are really looking at potentially another year of online programming. And I'm not hugely enthusiastic about that, but we're constantly coming up with new things. So we have a game night where we do things like Jeopardy and other sorts of games through Zoom, which are quite popular and a lot of fun. We find that people appreciate time to just hang out and chat with each other. As you said, you've got a moment after this to do that. So we have, instead of having 2-hour-long programs on Sunday mornings like we normally would do, have a sort of educational one and then our main gathering, we just have the main gathering and then time to chat and hang out afterwards and ask questions of the speaker. So it's much more participatory in that sense. We have tried a lot of different other things. One of our most popular events is our virtual travel club, where people talk about travel that they went to and share pictures of their holidays and stuff. And we did that in person before, and maybe like 15 people would come. Now like 60 people come from all over the world. It's bizarre. Like, I don't know why people hang out for 2 hours to talk to people about their vacations. It's so weird. People are really weird. People really need community. I mean, this time has demonstrated to me, I already knew that people need community. It's just a fundamental human need. But I now, like, am so much more convinced, like, it's necessary. I'm trying to start a peripatetic philosophy club, which will be in person. We'll meet at one of the little amphitheaters in our big local park in St. Louis and have a 15-minute presentation about some philosophical question. I'm going to text everyone a series of questions to discuss. They pair off it with masks and walk a path and talk about the philosophical questions like the old classical philosophers used to do. We'll see how that works, but I'm kind of excited about it. So we're constantly trying to generate things and see if they work. And it's been quite fun. I'm working all the time because it's like you can never separate your work and your home life when you're at home working all the time. And people sometimes, I think, don't appreciate how long it takes to set up like a Zoom program with music and a live presenter and a lot. Like people are like, oh, why can't we do that thing we used to do an hour before our main gathering? I'm like, well, because that whole hour I'm spending setting up for the gathering, right? I'm making sure the tech works and I'm putting the videos in the right place. I'm testing each video because Zoom is finicky about what happens. And so it's been a lot of work and there've been a lot of struggles, but the value and the strength of our community has been reinforced by this. I feel like I know many of our members better than I did when we were meeting in person, because they come like half an hour before to the Zoom meeting and we just chat, like we dance to the music and we chat and we just hang out. And I usually wouldn't have time for that because I'm a very busy, important person. And I'm always striding around our building making decisions. So people don't want to come up to me and talk to me. So it's been nice, actually, that aspect of it. But I am ready for it to be done. Like, I got into this work to be around people. I just like being with people in community. And you don't quite get that thrill of speaking in front of a community and feeling the feedback. You know, that there's a feeling of being in a room with a lot of people. And when it's working, when you can feel you're emotionally connecting, you know, you hear the laughter, you're making them cry. I love making my people cry. And they come up to me at the end of a Sunday and they're like, oh, I was crying when you told that story. I'm like, yes, I really connected with you. Moving hearts. But I was basically born to be a mega church pastor and have the handicap of being an atheist. Like, that's how I feel about this time.
Yeah, no, we're sort of similar in Columbus. It's unfortunate. Our governor did a really good job at the beginning of the pandemic and then just sort of fumbled a couple months in. Now we're back.
That's exactly where we are, Carl. Like, they shut down earlier than many and really went into lockdown, like our city, at a good time. Like, I was really proud, and then the political pressure mounted and they were just like, fuck it, I guess we better reopen. We don't meet any of the guidelines, but we better reopen. Let's make up some different guidelines and say we hit those. And everyone said what was going to happen. It did happen. I have a op-ed in our local newspaper about it that just came out yesterday. It says all that, so you can read it. I'm pissed. I'm really angry.
My daughter just visited from Indiana and she had to go into quarantine for 10 days once she came back because our area is a hot spot because of lack of leadership.
Right. It's exactly that. We're talking about leadership earlier. It's in a crisis that the need for clear, decisive leadership is most apparent. And I mean, I have to admit, I'm very proud with the way our community has responded. We've been very clear with our members about what we are and are not going to do and why, and people have totally accepted it. Honestly, I think the humanist community is playing a really important role as a whole during this because of our commitment to science and our commitment to humanity as the two, like, you know, our epistemic and our ethical commitments both come together at this time to be really important aspects of leadership. And the way that humanist communities have been able to say human life is the most important thing and you follow the best evidence to secure human life, like that is a really clear position that a lot of religious communities have struggled to articulate. And I've been proud to be a humanist during this. It's a good moment for us, the end of the world.
No, I found that as well, you know, like when we're making these decisions and you're like, man, this sucks. This really, really blows. I don't want to be making this decision. But then you sit down and you look at what are our values, and it's like, all right, when I think this through, it's tremendously evident what we have to do. I don't want to, but it's, this is where we're at. This is what we have to do for the betterment of our community.
Well, I'm sure that your members respect that and they value it. I think that most people are looking at what our political leadership is doing and just is aghast at how foolish and wicked it is, and are really happy when people tell them the truth, which is it's not good right now. It's not safe to be doing what we love to do, and we just have to find ways of dealing with that and be adult about it. I think people appreciate it.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I had. Does anybody else have anything else?
I have a left field question that's not about organizations or anything. It's more a professional opinion, I guess you could say, of yours, given that you're a philosopher and ethicist. Given that we are in this pandemic and we are experiencing the repercussions of leadership that, as you put it, you could describe it as wicked. It could be, I think, by the moral standard of secular philosophy, which is like human suffering equals evil. You could say that we're suffering the effects of like evil actions and evil policy right now. And it's very hard to go through that. And I think mentally a lot of people are struggling. I can only speak for myself when I say maybe for the first time in my life, I have to deal with trying to keep like hatred out of my heart, like just pure rage and hatred for people who are callously hurting millions of people for their own specific gain. What do you tell your community in this time when they're struggling with those feelings?
Well, first I say I totally feel what you're saying, and I struggle with it myself. One of the worst things about this has been my increasing frustration with my fellow human beings, and the sense of just the kind of sense of suspicion I have around other people when I go out and like, oh, you're not wearing a mask, or I don't like you. Or so there's a restaurant right outside our condo just across the road that never takes any notice of any of the guidelines. It reopened before restaurants were even allowed to be open, and every time I go by it now, I feel badly towards those people. I don't like what they did, and they're part of my community. I've lived here like 6 years, and I want to feel good about being in a neighborhood that has great restaurants and stuff, but I walk past it and I'm like, fuck those people. And that is a bad feeling to have towards other people all the time. And then towards the political leadership, I just have this disgust. I'm like, I can't believe it. I mean, it's so
I can
obvious.
Feel it like poisoning me. You know what I mean? It's like, I know sort of like logically, or just like, from like reading it and knowing it early that, these feelings, they hurt me more than they hurt, because they don't care about me. They don't care what I think. They don't care what I feel, but I'm having such a hard time not feeling just all of that towards them. And, I think for a lot of people, that's where a lot of the hardest part of this whole pandemic is coming from, is the fact that, you're basically isolated with your own feelings of anger and frustration and suspicion of your neighbors, and it's emotionally isolating as well as physically isolating. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, like what should a humanist do in such a unprecedented circumstance?
I think talking about these feelings is really valuable. I think sharing them is the first step, and finding out there's lots of people feeling the same way, that actually validating the feeling, like you're not wrong in a way to have that feeling. Like we can't control our feelings really. So like and it's not an unjust feeling to be frustrated and angry at people who are acting in a bad way that could harm us and our communities. So I think that first just kind of be like, yeah, there's nothing really wrong with the feeling, but I think you recognize the danger, which is that it hurts the person having the feeling more than it hurts it doesn't do anything positive to have the feeling. And honestly, I just talk it out with my husband. He's very good at this stuff. And he just says, yeah, you're right, but you just have to get on with it. Like that, he just is much less reactive than me to things like this, in the sense that, yeah, he's like, yeah, they suck. He actually, I think, has helped me in a way that he doesn't really expect people to be much better than that. Like, I feel like there's a sense in which humanists, I often try and remind myself and my people, I have a thing I say, which is humans aren't inherently evil, and they aren't inherently good. We're inherently animals, right? And we will respond in the way animals like us do to things. But even though I say that, I know that instinctively the whole emotional core of my humanism is about a certain goodness in people, right? When I go to those artistic works that express my humanism, it's like Star Trek and Contact and, things which really are about the goodness in people, and so West Wing, things like that. So I'm aware that there's a kind of disconnect between what I understand philosophically about people, given my humanism, what I feel emotionally. And I feel like one of the reasons I'm so angry and disgusted is because I'm disappointed, because I expected better, And I think one of the things that helps me is to say, your expectations are probably wrong. Of course, people are going to not obey the rules because they want to have a drink or because they want to party with their friends. Like, these are strong needs that animals have to be with each other for enjoyment. They're not going to be able to social distance. Like, we're the most social of all animals. It's an unreasonable expectation. Not like to make that expectation the basis of a feeling of disappointment is not really very rational. So that helps me a little bit to feel a bit better about things too.
You're talking about humanism and emotion. So as a chaplain, I feel like I have to step in. And also just
do your thing.
I think a part of it is this outlying judgment on the emotion itself. And James, you kind of talked about that. We judge the anger as being bad. We judge the frustration and just the whole like fuck you-ness of it as bad, instead of going, you know what? It's okay to be angry at this situation because it is a situation that deserves anger. And kind of to a part of what you're talking about earlier of, for me, it's just like, so what am I going to do with that anger? Am I just going to let that anger sit in me and eat away at me and just make me hate that neighbor across the street who has 12 people over at his house every day? Or, does it energize me to change something about the society? I think of, the civil rights movement, that was motivated by anger and compassion. And I think if we figure out how to combine those two things together, not judge our anger, but to go, okay, how can we be compassionate out of our anger? I think that goes a long way to, I think, for me anyway, to mitigate some of the negative, quote unquote, side effects of anger, high blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
I agree with that. And I want to pick up on one thing that you said, which is about validating that it's okay to have so-called negative emotions. Like we have yearly themes in St. Louis, and then we break them down into monthly themes to give a shape to the year, which we think is quite important. It's a sort of developmental arc to each year's programming. And one of our years was on the emotions, and every month we'd have an emotion or paired set of emotions that all our programming would be about. It was one of the best years we've done in terms of themes. It was such a good theme. And we found that one of the things we kept returning to was that humanists should validate emotions that are often perceived to be negative. That things like fear, doubt, anger, disgust are often seen as negative inherently, like that we should want to get rid of them if we have them, particularly ones like anger. And that's not right. They all serve an important regulatory process. and they all can attune us to features of the world that are very important to be attuned to. So we had a series of presentations about anger and activism. Now, actually, anger is essential. Like it's and appropriate a lot of the time. It's good to. It would be wrong not to feel angry about certain things. But a lot of, I think, traditional religious perspectives want to say there are good and bad emotions, right? And you shouldn't, you should try just not to have the bad emotions. And I ran into this very directly when I did my first memorial service, which was a memorial for a young man who had been killed in a hit and run accident just before his 21st birthday on New Year's Eve. That was my first memorial. My boss gave me that one. Thanks, Kate. And I worked with the family, particularly his mother, and it became clear in our discussions that she felt that she couldn't be angry and she couldn't be sad because her responsibility was to be upbeat for everybody else, and that there was somehow something wrong with expressing her anger. And a lot of the healing that we were able to achieve with that was by helping her understand that she was allowed to be angry, and she was allowed to be angry at the person who killed her son, and that anger and grief are not things to be suppressed, they're things to be felt through, and that is okay. And I think that's an important message that humanists can give the world.
I think so. On that note, it's kind of funny because before 2020, I'd actually been having regular conversations with my wife about, I kept coming back to that emotion of anger in my life as almost as a theme of growth, and go like, every time I find myself where I'm feeling angry more often than I feel like is appropriate, it's usually because I'm converting another emotion to anger. And so I was like gearing up to make like this year privately about like understanding why as a white man in America, I was getting angry so often, and what other emotions I might have, sublimated into anger, where I need to be okay with feeling other things. And I'm scared. It makes me something. I'll convert that to mad. I'm sad or disappointed. I get mad. Instead of feeling sad or feeling disappointed or feeling scared, and being okay with feeling those things. But the whole pandemic and all this other stuff, it kind of blurred that emotional journey for me, because I'm like, well, I like, to your point, I'm like, I think this is a pretty appropriate time to be really angry, but I don't know what to do with it. And I don't feel like that, like I'm alone in that. I think a lot of people are angry, and I think not knowing what to do with your anger, in my experience, it can turn inward and you just get really depressed because you feel impotent. And, just like as a child, when you rage out, it's like having a tantrum is like what happens right before you just curl up in a ball and cry, right? Because you end up giving up, and there's nowhere to express your rage. And I think personally that could be one thing that we could do as a community, is help people direct all that emotion they're feeling towards actions that are compassionate or advocating for justice. Yeah, that's 2 cents on that.
Yeah, and I think also the opposite is true. It's amazing the power of empathy that is gained when you're faced with anger and realizing that the anger is a secondary emotion to something else. Of going, oh yeah, that person just came lashing out at me. Why? Oh, because they're just as afraid of this pandemic as I am. They're feeling just as tied up as I am. So, instead of addressing the anger with the anger or the initial response with my own instinctual reaction, to step back and go, yeah, this is fucking frustrating time.
Yeah,
I get why you're
sure.
angry. And I think Polly
that was a bit of a tangent, but
Yeah,
I'll
sorry.
go ahead and turn it back over. No, for me, that was my tangent, but I'll go ahead and turn it back over to the regularly scheduled program with.
now for something a little bit lighter from Naresh. So he wanted to get the opinion from everybody. How do you feel if any time in the future, any presidential candidate would open themselves as a humanist? How would citizens take it? Would faith still be a major factor in electing a president of the country? I think at this point it still is. I would love to see the first humanist president, but
we kind of almost had our first major party candidate in Bernie as someone who's, you know, very open about his non-belief. He was very openly, I don't know if he ever used the word atheist. He might have, but I think he very clearly said, I don't have a religious tradition that I follow. And that's about as close as anybody's come, I think, to having a major political movement behind someone without faith in the United States. I would love it if it happened in the future. I think we're pretty close. I think it'll happen within my lifetime. But I don't know when that will be. And I don't know what would be more helpful if they actively promote themselves as like a specific philosophy, or if they just say, I don't have any religious belief whatsoever and leave it at that. I'd be interested to see what gets more traction. I just don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that religion clearly plays a significant role in US politics and culture still today. It's still definitely the case. But I think that's rapidly changing. I think that the change even between the time when I moved to the United States, which was like 12 years ago now or something, and now has been dramatic. And the nature of the conversation has totally changed. I think the old religious right is basically a spent force in American politics and is rapidly disintegrating. I think younger people in particular have absolutely no time for that flavor of politics. And so something new is going to develop. And I think that the kind of progressive social justice left that is emerging in the United States is temperamentally secular. I think that it doesn't really have a lot of religious language associated with it. And I think that that's a big difference. I think Bernie is a reflection of that, even though he's himself a lot older, but obviously beloved by that group. I wonder, I think the reaction to someone like Pete Buttigieg, who was a millennial Christian, who made a lot of use of his Christianity for progressive ends, was a very interesting moment in US politics. Firstly, because I thought that his mode of campaigning was ingenious, like to turn Christianity back against the religious right has been something that needs to happen in American politics for a long time. I think that as a mode of messaging, it was very, very powerful. I think, though, that it probably doesn't represent the direction of travel for the Democratic Party, because I think that most people of his age and younger are not religious. And so I think that the power of that narrative is actually more for older people. And so I don't know. It's one of those interesting things, because in my work, I've done some organizing, quite a lot of organizing with local religious people. And there is a revivified religious left in the country that's represented by things like the Poor People's Campaign and the Moral Mondays movement, which is a lot of clergy of a lot of different religious traditions working explicitly from their religion for justice. And I think that's great. But I actually think the political energy is with a secular expression, but I don't know that anyone's quite captured exactly what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I agree with that. I hope we have some, I mean, to James, to your point earlier of the importance of, claiming the, for lack of a better word, because of just culture and English language, the religious identification of a humanist or an atheist or a non-theist, versus just saying, well, I don't have any particular belief. I think that the movement of somebody being more claiming of a skeptic perspective, I think would go a long way. That doesn't mean I would necessarily vote for them, but it would certainly mean that I would, give them a deeper dive into what they're arguing for.
Yeah, to both your points, I think James earlier and Ben just kind of touching on it again now is this idea that being nothing is hard to bring shape to. We are animals, and we are social animals. We've evolved to have identities that are and those identities are best founded in something and not nothing. And so the idea that you just want to be disassociated or unaffiliated sounds great in theory, but when you try to create community around that, it's virtually impossible. And so I do think that whether or not it's whatever it's called, it will have values. It will whatever takes off and whatever does get traction, whether it's called I'm a nun, I'm unaffiliated, I'm whatever. I think in a lot of ways it will be humanist in ideology, humanist in values, but I still don't know what kind of label they're going to put on it, because I think those are really, really hard to predict, and sometimes they can be spur of the moment. Like some of our biggest movements right now, Black Lives Matter, started out as a Twitter hashtag that was just like an angry tweet, essentially going like, you know what, you all need to recognize Black Lives Matter, BLM, hashtag BLM or hashtag Black Lives Matter. That is now a massive civil rights movement. And so we don't really know what it's going to be called or how it's going to be labeled, but I think the values, the underlying values, probably will be humanistic, because let's face it, our government, all religions right now that are palatable in modern times, they're all humanistic in values, because if they weren't, we'd still be stoning people in the streets or cutting people's heads off like they do in Saudi Arabia when they dislike something. So yeah, I do think it's going to be humanistic, but I don't know what it's going to be called.
I think
James, what do you
point,
think of? Go ahead.
I just want to, so obviously I moved to St. Louis just before Mike Brown was killed. So I moved in June 2014 and Mike Brown was killed in July 2014. And I was pretty heavily involved in some of the street activism, and particularly the clergy-led street activism that happened in the first wave of protests after Mike Brown's murder in St. Louis. And what I saw there from this perspective of like the relationship of religion and politics in the United States was very interesting, which is sometimes clergy would turn up to like lead prayer circles and stuff, and street activists would tell them to go away, like that they didn't want them there and it wasn't about religion. And there was frequently tension between younger, broadly secular minded activists who may have had a religious view, but for whom it was orthogonal to what they were doing on the streets, and more established clergy who were trying to interpret what was happening within a religious framework. And I think that like so many things that happened in Ferguson and St. Louis after that killing, has turned out to be sort of a model for how this discussion has happened over in the country, that there is this new social justice culture that is not explicitly humanistic, right? It doesn't use that term, but it is definitely not religious. Like there is really no discussion of God or afterlife or any metaphysical commitments whatsoever in the online discourse around social justice. It just is absent. And that, I think, is the way that's how religion has lost its social and political power in other Western democracies. It has just faded away. It hasn't been replaced with a equally powerful humanist movement, right? It's just stopped being very important. It's just stopped being something that people talk about. I think that's what's likely to happen in America as well.
All right. I feel like we've had a long, productive discussion. Thank you, James. This was fantastic. Thank you for joining us. And I don't know, anything else anybody has to say in closing before we scoot on out of here?
I really appreciate you all. This is a fun conversation. I really enjoyed being here, so thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for attending it. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James.